They say some days change you forever, but you never expect it to be this kind of day. That quiet Thursday in Charleston was supposed to be just another chapter in my peaceful retirement. I had plans to sip my chamomile tea, flip through an old gardening book, and listen to the soft creak of the rocking chair beneath me. Nothing more. But then I heard it. Slow steps on the porch followed by a knock that somehow felt heavier than wood on wood. When I opened the door, there he stood, my grandson Caleb. Before I tell you the rest, let me ask, where are you listening from tonight? It's something I always wonder. Who hears these stories that feel like they should belong in some quietly intense indie film but are, in fact, pulled straight from life? It had been several months since Caleb last visited. Always the reserved one in the family, never one to make a fuss. He came around mostly on holidays or when his mother, my daughter, nudged him into it. And even then, he rarely lingered. But something was different this time. He stood on my porch in a gray wool coat pulled close, despite the gentle spring breeze. His curls were damp from a light drizzle, and his smile was thin, unsure, like it hadn't been used much lately. "Grandma," he said softly, "I hope it's okay that I dropped by." I stepped aside without hesitation. The old wooden floor beneath us groaned softly beneath his boots. A candle I'd lit earlier filled the house with cinnamon and vanilla. Caleb paused in the doorway, taking in the familiar space as though it had become unfamiliar to him. "You know you're always welcome," I said. But his eyes held something that didn't feel like a routine visit. We moved to the living room. I settled into my favorite chair while he stayed standing, his eyes drawn to the mantel, where old family photos sat lined in a tidy row. He stopped at the one of my late husband, Walter, taken on our anniversary trip to the Carolinas years ago. "I've been thinking about him a lot lately," Caleb said, his voice low. The words caught me by surprise. Walter had been gone for over a decade, and Caleb had only been a teenager then. "What about him?" I asked gently. Caleb didn't look away from the photograph. "The way he carried himself. The way he loved you. I don't think I ever really noticed it before." He finally sat down across from me. There was something in his posture, half folded in, half ready to unfold. It was like he'd been holding a conversation inside himself for days and had just now chosen to let it out. "I've been wrestling with a few things," he said, his hands clasped loosely. "And I didn't know who else I could talk to." A tug of affection pulled at me. Caleb wasn't one to open up. For him to come here, unprompted, meant more than he could probably say out loud. I leaned forward. "Well, I'm here. Whatever it is, we'll face it together." He ran a hand along his jawline. "I keep feeling like I'm stuck at the edge of something, like there's a version of life I've been too scared to live." His words were thick with meaning, not dramatic, but real, raw. I looked at him, really looked, and saw not just the boy I helped raise but the man trying to emerge beneath layers of doubt. "I know that feeling," I said. "You're not lost, Caleb. You're just waiting at the threshold. Sometimes you need someone to tell you it's okay to walk through." He didn't answer right away. But then he smiled, and it wasn't the tight, habitual smile I'd grown used to. It was warmer, gentler, like exhaling for the first time in days. "I had a feeling you'd get it," he said. We sat there a long while. The candle flickered on the table between us as he began to open up. About the pressure at work, about not feeling like himself anymore, about craving something more genuine than the life he'd been pretending was enough. With every word, his voice grew more certain, like letting the truth out was giving him back parts of himself he didn't know he'd lost. At one point, I reached across and laid my hand over his. He didn't flinch or hesitate, just tightened his fingers around mine like it was the most natural thing in the world. That simple touch felt like a quiet truce between us and the years we'd spent orbiting each other from a distance. As the daylight faded and shadows crept into the corners of the room, neither of us moved to turn on a lamp. The hush between us was soft and full, like the house itself was listening. "I don't know where it all goes from here," Caleb said at last. "But I'm done pretending I'm okay just drifting." I gave his hand a gentle squeeze. Then stop drifting. Life moves with or without you. Choose where it goes. When he finally stood to leave, there was a lightness in his steps I hadn't seen before. Something unburdened. I watched him make his way down the path, the porch light catching on the damp edges of his hair. And I thought, not every chapter needs an ending to be meaningful. As I closed the door behind him, I felt it. Something subtle but unmistakable had shifted. It wasn't dramatic, not the sort of moment you could explain to someone else without sounding foolish. But it clung to the air like the scent of distant rain. The kind that settles deep in the quiet of a house and makes you listen to your own breathing. Outside, the drizzle swept through Charlotte in gentle pulses, brushing against the windows like a slow lullaby. I just curled beneath a knit blanket, book open in my lap, when the porch light flickered on. For a second, I assumed it was the wind or maybe a stray possum. But then came the knock, soft, familiar. When I opened the door, there stood Caleb. His hoodie was soaked, curls darkened by the rain, dripping in soft rivulets down his face. "Sorry it's late," he said, a little out of breath. "I was nearby. And I needed to be somewhere that still makes sense." I didn't say a word, just stepped back. He stepped in quietly, boots brushing over the worn welcome mat that Henry and I had bought from a flea market decades ago. The rain followed him in gently, clinging to his jacket, to the ends of his sleeves, to the tension around his eyes. "Take a seat," I murmured, nodding toward the living room. He offered a tired nod and sank into the old floral couch while I wandered to the kitchen. I began preparing tea, letting the small rituals ground me, warming the teapot, measuring the leaves, filling each cup like I was offering something sacred. There's something in the rhythm of those movements that's always slowed my pulse. When I returned, 2 steaming cups in hand, Caleb had shrugged off his damp jacket and was gazing at the old grandfather clock in the corner. It belonged to my grandfather before Henry inherited it. I always told him it ran slow unless you whispered something kind when you wound it. Caleb didn't look away from the clock. "I've been thinking a lot about time lately," he said. "It feels different depending on what you're carrying." I placed the tray down carefully. "So tell me, what are you carrying tonight?" He held the cup with both hands, watching the steam as it danced and curled. The lenses of his glasses fogged a little. When he finally looked up, there was something raw in his expression, less guarded than usual. "Panic," he said, barely above a whisper. "And regret. And this pressure I keep pretending I'm built for." I didn't rush him. At 72, I've learned that silence is a gift. It gives people space to breathe into their truth. "I had a moment at work today," he continued. "My manager called it a performance dip. But really, I think I just noticed I can't breathe there. I walked out. I didn't quit, but I didn't stay either. And when I got outside, I didn't know where to go. So I ended up here." He took a slow sip, and I watched as the tension in his shoulders began to slip away. The windows whispered with silver rain. "I'm sorry you had such a hard day," I said gently. "But I'm glad your heart remembered the way to my door." That made him smile. "Not fully, but enough. I don't know who I'm supposed to be anymore, Grandma." Ah, that word. Supposed. I could see the weight of it draped over him like an overcoat 3 sizes too big. Even as a child he'd carried it. The good grandson. Quiet fixer. The one who never made waves. That kind of carefulness can wear a soul down if you carry it too long. "Come," I said. "Let me show you something." He followed me down the narrow hall to the room at the very back, the one Henry used as his workshop. It still smelled like him. A tangle of oil, cedar, and something faintly sweet like tobacco that had long since faded from use. After he passed, I couldn't bring myself to step inside for months. But one morning I opened the door, dusted the bench, and tried to learn what each tool meant. Not to become him, but maybe to keep him close. The room hadn't changed. Neatly arranged chisels. A scratched plane with its worn handle. Jars of screws labeled in Henry's tidy, stubborn handwriting. and on the top shelf, a simple wooden box. I lifted it down gently and placed it on the bench. I made this not long after Henry passed. Took me a whole month just to sand the corners. It was the only thing I ever finished in here. But I figured, maybe one thing done truthfully is enough. The lid creaked when I opened it. Inside, a small bundle of index cards lay neatly wrapped in twine, yellowed at the edges. Caleb looked at me curiously. "They're notes," I said. "Messages Henry used to leave me. When we fought, when I was tired, sometimes just because. I found a blank stack in the drawer after he passed. So I started writing my own. Not to him exactly, but to the moments that didn't make sense." "Can I read one?" he asked. He nodded. He untied the twine, took the top card and scanned it. Then stopped. His breath caught, just a little, and he let it out like someone setting down a burden they hadn't realized they'd been carrying all day. "What's it say?" he asked. He turned the card toward me. "You are allowed to be unsure. Rest anyway. Begin anyway." We stood there for a long moment with the card between us like a fragile lantern. The rain fell harder outside, drawing lines across the window panes like they were pages waiting to be filled. Caleb reached for another card and read it in silence, then tucked both carefully into his coat pocket. "Can I tell you the part under the panic?" he asked, voice hushed. I don't want the life I've been building. And I'm scared of what it'll cost to undo it." I leaned back against the workbench, the grain of the old wood pressing into my hip. I could have offered quotes, memories, well-meaning advice. But what I've learned across 7 decades is that people rarely need our words as much as our willingness to stay beside them. "What if we don't name it yet?" said. "What if we make a tiny plan? One so small it doesn't rattle your ribs." That drew a short, unexpected laugh. "A tiny plan. Yes. First you sleep. Then we eat something that crunches. After that, we each write down 3 things you don't want and 3 that you do. Tomorrow we pick one step that matches your list. No grand announcements. Just one step." He didn't respond right away. The quiet stretched out long enough for the tick of the living room clock to grow clear, each second falling like a soft nudge. Then he whispered, "I haven't really slept in weeks." "Then we'll begin there." I made up the guest bed with a quilt my mother hand-stitched from old shirts and curtains, patched and uneven in a way that made it perfect. Caleb lingered in the doorway like a kid again, hands deep in his pockets, eyes drifting around the room like it might scold him. "Do you ever feel guilty just resting?" he asked. "All the time," I said. "So I practice not apologizing to the pillow." He gave a crooked grin. Some small knot in his face seemed to uncoil. When he finally laid down, he didn't say goodnight. Just stared up at the ceiling, waiting for permission maybe. I turned off the lamp and left the door slightly ajar, the way I used to for my kids when the wind outside made everything seem bigger. Back in the living room, I sat with my cooling tea and pulled out a blank index card. I wrote what we talked about, 3 things he doesn't want: to be praised for work that drains him, to keep treating anxiety like a normal state, to be the silent solution everyone relies on. 3 things he does: to build something with his own hands, to have one real conversation each week, and to belong to a day that starts without dread. I set the card against the clock, where I'd see it at first light. Around midnight, I heard the soft creak of the hallway floor. Caleb stood in the doorway, hair tousled, wearing that expression people wear when their minds won't let go. "Can't sleep?" "Yes. I keep hearing voices, my manager's, my dad's, mine," he murmured. "I don't want to be unfair. They're just trying to help. Everyone wants me to succeed." He was right, of course. Love and pressure. 2 coats often sewn from the same thread. "Come here," I said, patting the couch cushion beside me. "Breathe with me." He sat, and I shared the trick a hospice nurse once taught me when Henry was ill. Inhale for 4 counts, hold for 4, exhale for 6. We breathed together, the dim light pressing us into stillness like a lullaby. His shoulders slowly settled. "It's weird," he said finally. I'm 37 and learning how to breathe from my grandmother. Lucky you, I replied. I'm an expert. A soft chuckle escaped him. His gaze drifted to the photo of Henry on the mantel, the one where he's got that half-proud smile he used to wear after fixing something that didn't quite need fixing. I miss him, Caleb said quietly. I didn't know him the way you did, but tonight I keep thinking about what he'd say. He'd say, "There's no trophy for who can hold their breath the longest," I offered. He'd say, "Take care of my girl." And by girl he'd mean me and you too. In this family, those words stretch. We sat until the hour turned soft and the clock nudged us toward trying again. Caleb yawned and rose, glancing back once at the photo, then down the hallway. At the door to the guest room he turned. "Grandma." "Yes, love. Would you be upset if I called Mom tomorrow and said I needed some space?" "No, Caleb. I'd be proud of you for choosing your own voice. And I'll be here when you're done." He nodded, then disappeared into the dark. At dawn the storm had gentled. The air held the hush of rain, making peace with morning. In the kitchen I sliced apples and toasted bread, the knife tapping a steady rhythm that soothed my thoughts. When Caleb came in, his hair sticking up in odd angles, he looked older and younger all at once. I handed him a plate. He ate quietly, like someone who'd been forgiven something. After a few bites, he reached into his pocket. "I found this again," he said, holding up the first card. "It kept me company last night." "I wrote another," I said, and handed him the one from the clock. He read it once, then again. His finger hovered over one line in particular, "To belong to a day that begins without dread." "I don't even know what that looks like," he murmured. "We can borrow one," I told him. "Start with mine. First we open the workshop. And then we fix something small." His eyebrows lifted. "A fix, huh? There's a drawer in there," I said. "Been giving me grief for months." We stood side by side at Henry's old workbench. I showed Caleb how to rub wax along the sides, how to feel for warping in the wood grain, how to press gently and listen, really listen, to what the piece wanted rather than trying to dominate it. It's a lesson that stretches far beyond furniture. He loosened a stubborn screw, sanded down just the edge. Barely a whisper. And when he slid the drawer back, it moved in and out with the grace of something well understood. "There," I said. "One corner of the universe made slightly better." He looked at his hands in wonder, like they'd just returned to him from somewhere far away. "I forgot how that feels." "What?" "To make something cooperate without forcing it." He stayed the rest of the morning. At one point, he stepped onto the porch and called his mother. It wasn't an argument, just a quiet, steady conversation with clear lines and a lot of heart. When he came back in, his face looked different. Lighter, like the world had moved closer instead of stepping back. We walked slowly to the end of the block and back. The street smelled of damp soil and warm pavement. A little boy raced past on a bicycle, splashing through a leftover puddle, waving like we were part of the landscape he trusted. When we returned, Caleb asked if I could tell him a story about Henry that I'd never shared. So I did. I told him about our first winter together, how the furnace died in the middle of a Carolina cold snap, and Henry cobbled together a contraption using an old fan and a space heater to funnel warmth into the hallway. We ate soup by the bedroom door, bundled in blankets, because it was the only place where you couldn't see your breath. He looked absolutely ridiculous, I said. But he kept saying, "We're warm enough," like it was a promise instead of a fact. Caleb laughed, really laughed. That open, head-tilted kind of laugh I hadn't heard from him since he was young. Then he went quiet. "Grandma," he said, "what if I don't go back to the same job?" "Then you don't," I replied. "What if I disappoint people?" "You will," I said gently. "And they'll recover. Your life is not a group assignment." He looked at me like he was studying my face, trying to trace the lines that might reveal where I'd learned to say things like that. "How did you get to be like this?" "By staying alive," I said. And by loving people who didn't always love how I stayed alive. Then, instead of reaching for my hand, Caleb reached for the index card. He turned it over and wrote something slowly, then slid it across the table. Thursdays. Build something. Talk like it matters. I can do Thursdays, he said. Even if I go back for a while, I can still do that. Then Thursdays it is, I told him. We'll be builders of more than just wood. He flushed, a little shy at the phrase, but nodded with a seriousness I hadn't seen in him before. We cleared the table side by side, washing and drying like a well-worn team. When it was time to leave, he paused in the doorway again, the very same spot where he'd stood the day before. Only this time, he wrapped his arms around me in a hug that wasn't rushed or polite or unsure. It was real, solid. Thank you, he murmured into my shoulder. For what? For not asking me to make sense, he said. Just for tea and time. I watched him walk down the path, his steps quiet but sure, his spine unbending. The sky had cleared. The maple tree next door shimmered gold, catching the sun like it was holding a dozen tiny lanterns. I stood in the doorway for a while with the house breathing around me. Then I went back to the workshop, opened the drawer again, just to hear that clean, smooth slide. A sound of cooperation, not conquest. On the bench sat the wooden box of notes. I pulled a new card and wrote in the same even print I've used all my life. For recipes, permission slips, grocery lists, and things I wanted the future to hear. You can change without disappearing. You can rest without failing. Love is the room we build to return to. I tucked the card underneath the others and closed the lid. The silence that followed was thick, peaceful. And that's when I realized the most surprising part of it all wasn't that Caleb showed up unannounced. It wasn't even that he asked for help. The unreal thing. We let ourselves be seen. And once that happens, ordinary days never feel quite so ordinary again.